News First, Newsline.
Hello there, a very good evening and welcome to another edition of Newsline. Tonight we're coming to you live and direct from our News First studios here in Colombo. Tonight's guest is no stranger to the show, but hasn't quite been on the show for quite a long time. After a massive leave of absence, we welcome back to Newsline Professor Rajiv Vijay Singh, a political historian and analyst. Very good evening, Professor.
Thank you very
welcome to the
much.
show.
Yeah, nice to be here after years. Yes.
Professor, why the absence from television in all forms of civil activism?
Well, to be quite honest, no one's asked me. But I think this happened because I was asked once or twice during the COVID period, and I couldn't make it. I mean, I was stuck because of the curfew outside Colombo for quite a long time. And then about a couple of years, I actually wrote a long series on why I was just completely full of what I call ennui. Exhaustion, unwillingness to do anything, comment, because the situation just seemed to me hopeless. This was in 2021, actually.
You mean the situation in the country?
In the country. Nothing was moving, no one was interested in moving. It was just such incompetence. And in a sense, a couple of months later, I was asked by the government to do something. And
this was back in 2021.
2021, before the crisis hit, but I'd already realized the situation was pretty ghastly. And there was nothing one could do because everyone one had counted on. You remember in 2015, I supported Maithripala Sirisena, everything was betrayed. Then in 2019, I was very sensible. I stood for president simply because I thought neither of the candidates was good enough. But I didn't think either was particularly bad. And I was so shocked by how Gotabaya collapsed and did absolutely nothing. And not that I was involved much. If you spoke to anyone, people around Gota said, well, he can't do anything because Mahinda is a menace. And people around Mahinda said, Gota won't listen to me. And, it was just bizarre that how that relationship between the two brothers played out. Both very fond of each other, but just incapable of talking direct. And their advisors, I think, destroyed both of them, especially the third brother, who wasn't sure which side he was on except his own. So then you had this situation where I just thought, there's no point. And when I was asked to do something, I'm glad I said I just don't want to.
You mean you were offered a government position?
One of the independent commissions to try it, which is something perhaps later I wondered, should I have taken it? But, because if you don't take something, then are you in a position to criticize afterwards? Because I know someone who was probably given the offer at the central bank. I don't think Ranil wanted it. And then Mahinda took over instead. And I'm sure she's always, I don't know whether kicking herself. She's not someone who kicks herself. But she must have wondered, my God, if I'd taken it, would we have been saved the complete corruption that set in? And the high interest rates, as you know. And I don't think she would have permitted the massive borrowing from private foreign funds and so on.
ISBs.
That happened in the next 4 years. So, I wondered, but fortunately, I think, although it made me very old and very tired, I got COVID. So when the offer was renewed and the president himself rang, I had to say, I'm actually ill. I can't make up my mind. And then fortunately, he appointed someone else. But when all hell broke loose last year, I thought, well, I'm just well out of this. But I didn't really want to comment, because I thought, I wrote on my Facebook, for instance, I thought people were completely mad to say Gota must go, inefficient and incompetent as he was, unless you had an alternative in place. And of course, they ended up with the worst alternative in the world. So I thought, what's the point of saying anything? But, I stopped doing press releases and so on. But then I think in the last 3 weeks, I have been astounded and perhaps moved out of what I would have thought was a pleasant retirement by all these efforts to subvert the Supreme Court by the president. Endlessly, not only with regard to elections, but, what you might call anticipatory bail, when people had objected to the what he's done. Yes, what he's done there, which is outrageous. You can just imagine saying, I'm not going to listen to the Supreme Court. which is, and it struck me that the man is becoming more and more like the monster JR. Because if you remember, you probably don't, you're probably too young, but JR seemed on top of the world in 1982 when he'd won a referendum, admittedly totally fraudulently and by jailing the opposition and by fiddling.
This is to extend the parliament's term.
Extended it, put Vijay Kumar Tunga in jail, accused him of a Naxalite plot, which Ranil kept reiterating in parliament. But everyone thought, okay, the electoral map is rolled up for years. And then he overreached himself. And how did he overreach himself? What was the beginning of the end? The attack on justices of the Supreme Court. I think most people have forgotten this, that in 1983, February, March or so, a gang of goons surrounded the Supreme Court. They were very angry that the Supreme Court had found against them. And when this made people upset, what did they do? They sent a man called Kalulaki and said, no, I'm an ordinary citizen. I'm very upset that people are protesting. Protests destroy the ordinary way of life and people should not tolerate protests. And I'm just an ordinary citizen. And then 2 days later, the Sun revealed that he had married with Ranil Wickremesinghe as an attesting witness. So the goons,
So I think that's kind of the things that's happening.
Precursor
right now.
of what's happening now.
It's the vicious cycle.
Goons and hooligans and intimidation of the best, let's say, refuge the country has, which is at the moment the courts, because Parliament is an outdated institution now. Everyone knows that none of those people will be voted in if they have an election. The president was elected by that parliament, having failed completely to even get into parliament earlier. And, Colombo 7, I think, thinks there are no queues and he's reducing the debt. But you've seen, the dollar is appreciating again against us. Debt is mounting. And, the whole point of getting into debt is to use the money productively. So that even though you have to pay interest, you will generate income more than that.
There will be a return on your investment.
But there's absolutely nothing. There has been nothing done to develop productivity. Just look at the latest. They raised electricity tariffs, and they said because of this we won't have to cut power. And now they're saying that we can't give the farmers water, and the crops are drying, and then we'll have to pay more in order to buy paddy. And, Kanchana Vijay says, no, how can I give them? They'll then have to have power cuts. I mean, what sort of planning is there? What sort of care for two things, the future of the country and for those who don't have sufficient income to survive in these days of inflation? It's just outrageous. So I thought, time I started writing. And I was struck by, I think, ironically, it's the NPP that's taken the lead in making legal cases. And they've got the best counsel. They're using this chap Nigel Hatch for a lot of things. Very, very able man. And he's not frightened. I'm very struck when there was a report in the Island about how he'd, told Dinesh Guruvandla, who I find so depressing, because Dinesh is a nice, decent man, and he's so totally under the thumb of his schoolmate. And Nigel had said, what would the Lion of Borroloogood have said? And I remember Philip Gunawardena, magnificent figure in Parliament, man of great ideals. He left, again under pressure from another of Ranil's kinsmen, Bandaranaike's cabinet. He introduced the Paddy Dance Act, a very, very important thing, because unless you begin land redistribution, you cannot develop a country. And there was a lot of pressure led by Vimla Vijayawardena, Ranil's aunt by marriage. And he left the cabinet. He was a very independent-minded man. And I always thought Dinesh, although a bit nervous, a bit frightened, never acts quickly, but I thought he was an idealist. And I was glad that Nigel, pointed out how sad it is to see Philip Gunawardena's son in this pitiful position. And I thought, so I think you'll ask me because I had circulated it on Facebook. And then the Council for Liberal Democracy did a statement which appeared in the Financial Times yesterday. Also very important. And then today, on top of that, I think we find the Supreme Court has really done another very, very important thing. It said that the Local Government Amendment Act is unconstitutional and needs a two-thirds majority and a referendum. So what are these people doing? Killing the country, killing it much worse than Gota ever did, because Gotas were blunders. This is viciousness.
Blunders, you mean blunders as mistakes?
Oh, yeah. Well, the fertilizer business, all that.
So are you telling that the president of the country didn't have enough advisors to tell him that this fertilizer change in policy is not going to work?
Apparently people told him and he wouldn't listen. But I think the more horrendous thing is what he did in 2019. I was at Inland Revenue today because I'm always very conscientious about my tax. And for 2 years I hardly paid any tax because they cut taxes, they cut withholding tax. And the Inland Revenue people told me, it's very odd, but there's vindictiveness. People blame Cabral. In fact, when the plan, Cabral was meant to tell it to the Inland Revenue told him that this is a nonsense, because the entire income flow that the country gets through withholding tax, through pay, all that was cut. Gota just gave in to somebody, but it wasn't Gota, because what they told me was that apparently Cabral listened to them and went and reported. The man who's got out of it with absolutely no criticism is P.B. Jayasundara. He turned up the next day and said, we are going to cut this tax regime and it'll be like this. The Inland Revenue told me. This will be the situation for the next 5 years. And no one has criticized him. Of course, making him secretary of the president was a blunder, and that again people said was what the other Rajapaksas insisted on. And when PB finally went, they replaced him with Gamini Senarath, who had nothing to recommend him except his association with Mahinda. And you compare that with Mahinda, who appointed Lalit Veeratunga, who was an able man. Could have been tougher with Mahinda, but an able man. And of course, Premadasa, who appointed the most sterling of civil servants, Mr. Vijayadasa. And instead you have P. Vijayasundara with these cockeyed economic theories. He was a very old man also by then. No one has blamed him for it. They appointed W.D. Lakshman as chairman of the central bank, who was a sweet man but far too old, and he said yes to everything. And nothing. Those tax cuts were disastrous. The entire income of government collapsed.
But Professor,
and no one's fingering that now. People have forgotten that government became bankrupt. Okay,
because
COVID did a lot, but there was absolutely no income. And then because WHT and all these were done, many people didn't bother to do their tax, especially old people who had been paying withholding tax and therefore had never had tax files. Many of them were too old to do this, so they thought, we'll be dead by the time they catch up with us. I had hell, having to calculate withholding tax. I know my brother-in-law had to do it for his two aged sisters, who would never have done it if it weren't for him. And a lot of old people just wouldn't have done it. So government lost revenue, and no one's thinking of that now.
Professor, as a political historian, you look back at history and see how things will pan out now. I think people are curious to know as to what your analysis is of how things will happen, because you compared the current system or the current things that are happening in the country to the time when President J.R. Jayawardena was in power. And of course, there is also a relationship between the current president and President J.R. Jayawardena. So how do you see this?
Symbiotic. Huh?
How do you see these two panning out?
Well, you see, what happened to J.R. Jayawardena is he overreached himself. It's called hubris. Greek tragedy is full of it. A man gets to the top and then thinks I can do anything. So he attacked the Supreme Court. The response to that was very, very clear, that the people who had even voted for the referendum realized the man is a monster. But then he went further. He attacked the Tamils in July 83. And you know perfectly well, I think Sarath Amugamma's memoirs recently mentioned how both Esmond Wickramasinghe and Ranil Wickramasinghe are involved in this, and Esmond's brother, Bishop Lakshman Wickramasinghe, one of the most wonderful minds this country has had. chaired the civil rights movement. Mind you, he set up the civil rights movement in '72 when he thought the Bandaranaike government was ill-treating the JVP. You know, people used to accuse him of being partisan. He's not partisan. And Sir Thammukalam says he died because his relations had got involved in this, the attack on the Tamils. And then what happened? Having attacked the Tamils, they suddenly realized, oh my God, you remember JR's response, 28th July? The understandable reaction of the Sinhalese to attempt to divide the country. And I'm therefore going to punish the Tamils. Now, the Tamils have been punished by these killings. What happened from 24th onward? He introduced the 6th Amendment. The very next day, Black Friday, more attacks, because he actually basically told the Sinhalese it's okay to kill Tamils now. He'd said the night before. And then after that, that was the end. India came down like a ton of bricks. His Western allies just had to drop him, and they've now all turned very anti-Sri Lanka, but they've got the wrong end of the stick, because instead of looking at what JR had done wrong, they ended up supporting the terrorists. And that's why Mahinda, who with all his faults at least got rid of the LTT, which was a very important step. But because the West was so anti him, he got bitter and nasty and became a chauvinist. Whereas up to 2009, I think he had every intention of, moving forward. Because he promised India that he was going to implement the 13th Amendment and all that. So 83, and after that, Jaya was a lame duck. If you look at the history from 83, my biography of Jaya, political biography, no one's ever done that before, came out a couple of years ago. That's what I've been doing really in the last 5 years. And it details how he was a lame duck. Now, I think the same is true of Ranil now. But at least we have a quicker terminus ad quem. He's only got a year to go. If he doesn't succeed in subverting the election process. But I don't think the country will allow that.
So you think there are attempts to even subvert a presidential election process next year?
Of course. If you can not have a statutory election by saying that there's no money in the treasury, even though this is the same man who offered perks to, people in the SLFP who wanted
ministerial positions.
And they were told, you can't have ministerial position, but we'll give you all the perks. I don't know whether you know that Ranil did the same thing in 2002. He had ministers and their budgets had no operational funds. Do you know what I mean? The minister gets an amount of money to set up a ministry and pay his staff and give jobs to his catchers. But they had no operations. Look at the budget estimates for 2002, 2003. So he's an absolute specialist in, what they call bread and circuses. The Roman emperors. But Ranil's difference is he doesn't give bread and circuses to the population, he gives it to his chums.
What does the population get?
Nothing. Starvation. Look at this. Look at
Professor, very interesting point in our conversation. Unfortunately, we have to cross over to a short commercial break, but we will bring more of this, amazing analysis, of course, a lot of history, a lot of lessons to learn from past mistakes that Sri Lankan leaders have made and Sri Lankan people have made as a country. Stay tuned. You're watching Newsline. We'll be right back.
News First, Newsline.
4 excise officers who were arrested by police during a drug raid granted bail.
මේ සියල්ලත් විමර්ශන කරලා ගරු අධිකරණයට ඒ පිළිබඳව ඊළඟ දිනේදී දැනුම් දීමට කටයුතු කරනවා.
මෙම ඇති වූ සිද්ධිය සම්බන්ධයෙන් අතිශයින්ම කනගාටුවට පත් වෙනවා.
Water released from the Samanala River to the Udavala Reservoir. Programs in place for uninterrupted supply of electricity. Another generator at the Noracholi power plant goes out of service. Another Aragalaya under the guise of farmers' crisis. President gets intelligence report, reveals Minister Bandula. 8 people arrested for illegally entering CBSL.
News First, Newsline.
Welcome back. You're watching Newsline Live. We're in discussion with Professor Rajiva Vijayasinghe, a political historian and analyst. Professor, we were speaking about parallels about what happened in the past here, right here in Sri Lanka, and what is happening now, how similar these two are. We were on the point of the attacks on the Supreme Court. I think several institutions had voiced their concern against this. We know right now as we speak, an election has been announced, the local government election, and the Supreme Court directed the Secretary to the Ministry of Finance to release the funds that were allocated for the election by Parliament. Parliament has fiscal power in Sri Lanka. The Parliament has allocated this money, and the Secretary to the Ministry was ordered by the Supreme Court by way of an interim order to release these funds. But to date, none of those funds has been released.
Actually, that's a very good point you made, because if you know, I mean, this consummate hypocrite, his latest line about, you know, the debt restructuring is Parliament has control of finances. But when Parliament has, with its control of finances, has allocated something, the executive refuses to give it. Does this mean he's in contempt of Parliament? And of course, you have this bizarre collection of parliamentarians who, well, they're still sticking together because they know that once they fall apart.
Once the Parliament is dissolved.
Yeah. No, but if they don't stick together for the moment, then Parliament will have to be dissolved, or there'll have to be a new government. But the reason they, I suspect, won't stick together much longer is you have the most devious minds trying to outmaneuver the other. And, you know, it's just ironic that whom has Ranil chosen as his instrument to break up the NPP? Mario Lanza, not Mario Lanza. Mario Lanza was a famous singer. Wonderful name, Nimal Lanza. And everyone who knows Lanza's history will understand why precisely Ranil Wickremesinghe has chosen Nimal Lanza as his hatchet man. And of course, then you have Basil, not quite sure what's hit him, that his puppet is now beginning to pull his own strings. Mahinda seems to be out of it, really, but you shouldn't dismiss Mahinda too easily, because he's, you know, he's obviously gritting himself to stay in it till he can hand over something to Namal. But obviously he must realize that there's no way that Ranil is going to hand over anything to Namal. You know, and whatever he promises, don't forget all those promises to Sajit, to Karu, to this one, to that one. So you have that little dynamic going on in there. And even the Sunday Times, which is, you know, obviously much more pro-Ranil than any other paper, but has a certain level of journalistic integrity still, has realized what is wrong with all this. So there's that dynamic on that side. And then you have, of course, these repeated efforts to subvert Parliament, but say Parliament is in charge of the Supreme Court. You know, it's a bit like, I don't know, again, if you remember, when the courts awarded something to Mrs. Bandaranaike, the UNP said, the government said in Parliament, no, this is sub judice, you can't touch it. But later they said, oh, people are bringing things to the court in order to subvert Parliament. You know, sheer hypocrisy. It's also all in my book about, you know, I pointed out how the political biography of Jaya, which came out, Godage and Sons published it about 2 years ago. And it really sums up a lot of the sheer hypocrisy. But it also shows that his hatchet man was Ranil, because again the Sun Group, the Weekend, revealed that when JR announced the referendum and immediately demanded undated letters of resignation from his MPs, it was Ranil who took the printed forms around. It's in the Weekend newspaper that Sunday. And it just makes it clear that this was the JR Ranil combination, which is still destroying this country now. And, you know, and unfortunately, don't have public servants like my father. My father, who had, you know, Jaya didn't write while he was Secretary General of Parliament. My father said, you know, if someone dates a letter and gives it to me, I don't accept it. So they said, why? He said, it's a forgery. If a man has signed a letter and someone else puts a date on it, that is not the letter the man signed. And he said, I would have argued the case in court. You know, it's like Kalawana when they tried to create a new MP. And they ignored my father. Then when there was a problem, the Supreme Court ordered a by-election. They said, you know, you had to have a referendum to have a by-election because the government brought a bill to have 2 members of Kalawana. And JR had finally called my father. They hadn't asked him before and said, Sam, how do we get out of this? And my father, he said, it's very simple. Tell Pilapita to resign. This was the Borough MP for Kalawana. And JR said, but Sam, you then have to report it. So my father said, why? He said, the Constitution says the Secretary General shall report any vacancy. And my father said, you're reading that all wrong. It is the Secretary General shall report any vacancy. And if the Secretary doesn't think there is a vacancy, and I don't think there's a vacancy if this man who was appointed contrary to the Constitution claims to be an MP, if he resigns, there's no vacancy. The Supreme Court order that he was corrupt and had to give up his seat and there should be a by-election stands. And JR had then said, yes, but Sam, what if you're prosecuted in the court? My father has said, let me handle that. One thing I ask is that you don't let the Attorney General's department anywhere near my case. JR had turned to people.
Professor, we're in the final few minutes of the program.
But I just want to give you the anecdote.
Very interesting
You need people
stories.
of courage and you need people who understand the spirit of the Constitution. Not someone who'll cherry pick like Ranil does. Today Parliament is supreme, then the next day no, Parliament is not supreme, the executive is supreme. Or executive says no money, there's no money. I am the executive, I will do what I like with the money. I'll give it to all the hangers-on to have officers where they do no work.
But Professor, the argument at least that is coming from the side of the government these days is that we are in a fix. We need to get out of this fix. And the only way that we can get out of this fix, at least according to the government, is by the debt restructuring program that is ongoing, the agreement that we have with the IMF, and all of these steps were taken by this current government, headed by President Ranil Wickremesinghe. And he says he is not of any party, he is here wholeheartedly to take this country out of the mess that the country has been put in, of course, by various previous administrations, and even his ministers are kind of saying the same thing. So should the people believe, because there are those who do genuinely believe that maybe this combination will work out. What do you have to say?
Combination of Ranil Wickremesinghe, Rohit Abegunasekara, Mahinda Alutkamage, efforts to put in Johnston Fernando, Nimal Siripala de Silva, whom the Japanese reported for corruption. I mean, don't be silly. What are the problems? The problem is the massive debt that really rose much more between 2015 to 2019. Remember how interest rates went up after Mahendra. Cabral had kept interest rates at about 10%, shot up to 12 after that. Every round after that had to go up. Then, you know, the Chinese who actually helped us, I mean, China helps us for their own sake. But when Ranil came in and attacked the Chinese, they screwed us. The Hambantota deal that Malik Samarikma signed. You know, 99 years when he had been offered 49, but he chose 99. That was Malik Samarikma, Ranil's great crony. So all that has contributed to the mess. Gota also contributed like hell, so did COVID, etc. But the very simple thing is take the debt restructuring. This is not an IMF decision. This is what was asked by the private foreign fund donors. And I was talking to a friend of mine in England who's a financier, commerce development, has done some work here, international finance. And he said, you know, why is he doing this? Because it creates unpopularity and it makes your country poorer. But what you have to do is you have to cut the debt for the foreign donors because they put their money in. They were told things are risks. They know that they have to take a haircut.
They were paid a premium on that risk.
Of course, they were paid a massive premium. So cutting them, but they are the ones who asked that the domestic debt be restructured. And why should pensioners and so on have to suffer so badly when what you have to do is cut by another 2 percentage points the massive debt that you're paying those people and tell them take it or leave it. Because they can't leave it because don't forget they'll be back when we float another loan. And you won't have the careful management of loans that we had until Ranil took over. Because don't forget that under what they call, Ranil would call them private placements, they weren't private placements. Under placements at low interest rates, we governed interest rates very well up to 2014. But then, in ignoring the plans for the next crunch of repayments, they allowed them to skyrocket in 2015 because of Mahendran. And what has happened to Mahendran? When is the money that Mahendran made going to be given back to us? Why isn't perpetual treasuries just taken over by the government and all its profits given to the people to stop this plundering of the poor people of this country?
Professor, very, very pertinent questions, of course, and I think it's important to remind the general public that this government came on the promise that they will bring the former central bank governor who is accused of robbing the central bank down to the country within a mere months of coming into power. But well, those stories are all a fantasy, and we know where we stand today. Thank you very much, Professor Rajneesh Singha, for joining us on our program. Thank you very much to all our viewers out there also for tuning in. Until we meet again, take care and God bless.